Well, it's a great privilege to be here. As Ronald Reagan used to say at my age, it's a great privilege to be anywhere. The age is important because my life actually spans this rethinking of history. I was born on the 6th of July, 1944 in Chicago. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was in the White House. Hitler was in his bunker somewhere. Churchill was at Chequers, and so on and so on. And my first recollections of television is seeing Harry Truman ordering troops into North Korea, and then I lived with Eisenhower. I've lived through 13 presidents. I've been in Australia since 1973. I think I've been through 100 Australian prime ministers. That's just a joke. We've had a lot of them in the last couple of years. They play a very different game. But I arrived right after Gough Whitlam was elected, and I've got to meet every prime minister, including the one that was before him, John Gorton. And so it's been a very privilege. From Australia, I've been able to develop my students and my viewpoints about nuclear weapons and defense and foreign affairs and security. From the United States, I learned a great deal about American foreign policy, and it's realist-based. I was also a student in 1964-65 for 18 months at the University of Vienna, where I studied comparative communist systems. I was going to be America's great analyst of communism. I was looking at Moscow-dominated communism, the Chinese and the Vietnamese, and today I host a lot of workshops from Chinese academics and defense people and the Vietnamese people, Vietnamese defense and foreign policy people, and I think they weren't even being studied at the University of Vienna in those days because they hadn't made their mark. No one thought they were going to survive very long. And on weekends, I used to come to places like Prague or Budapest. I went through Checkpoint Charlie. I was here for May Day in 1965. Some of you people probably remember that day. And I was very impressed with Czechoslovakia. As a student of history, I was very impressed with how the Czechs were abandoned at Munich. They were abandoned in February 1948. They were abandoned in 1968. And so on and so on. So I learned from your own experience and from the small power experience that sometimes you're on your own, so you have to be very clever. Large states can make mistakes and not disappear from the face of the earth. Small states make mistakes and they disappear from the face of the earth. That is the nature of the game, so you have to be a little bit ahead of it. I also have a Czech connection. When I was 14 years old, I had a Czech girlfriend in Chicago. And my first professor at the University of Denver was Joseph Korbel, who was a former diplomat. Most of his career was fleeing from people, but he seemed to do pretty well with that one. I did not get to meet his daughter, Madeleine Albright, but that's a different story. So I had that kind of connection. And I just want you to know that I've lived through everything that we're going to be talking about for 2 days, and I'm going to go to most of the sessions, and I'd like to meet with you because I didn't come here, as Martin Luther King once said, to Nashville, Tennessee, when I was in the audience. He said, I didn't come here to inspire you, I came to be inspired. Because things that go on in different places inspire people who travel around the world. So I have a great deal to learn from you. Now, every November, I receive from the Council of Foreign Affairs a survey. And it's part of their Preventive Priorities Survey. And what they do is they ask 7,000 scholars to identify and rank the most dangerous places on Earth for the next 12 months. That is, the danger spots, the conflict areas, and the like. And you rank them into Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. I mention this because the things that we picked out in November 2017 became major issues, were major issues at the time, and became major issues in 2018, all dealt with in certain ways, one of which impacts you directly. The first thing that the scholars chose as the likely place of a conflict was a severe crisis in North Korea caused by nuclear or ICBM nuclear weapons, particularly making these ICBMs. America has had a difficult time dealing with North Korea. Actually, everybody has. But when they started developing missiles that could reach the lower 48 states And then when they could reach missiles that had missiles that could reach the East Coast of the United States, they got everybody's attention. If you want to grab America's attention, just aim an ICBM at them or threaten to do so, and you got everybody's attention, even Donald Trump. And I didn't vote for Donald Trump. I'm a dual national. I voted for the other person, but he's our president and we have to deal with him. He's our 45th president. He's my 13th president. And if you knew anything about the presidency, you'd even want to know, you'd wonder why anybody wants the damn job. We've had 45 presidents. 30 of them have been shot at. 8 of them have died in office, and 4 of them have been murdered. So your chances of dying in office are about 18%, and your chances of being shot at are 67%. And it only pays $400,000 a year. I mean, who wants this job? Very ambitious people want the job. You know, because as John Kennedy once said to an audience, it is the ultimate source of action. But let's get back to those crisis points that we figured out. Severe crisis in North Korea by nuclear or ICBMs, a deliberate or unintended military confrontation between Russia and NATO members stemming from assertive Russian behavior. What do the Russians want? I've spent half my life trying to figure out what the Russians want. I mean, we worked out when we were young that Stalin wanted satellite peoples, he wanted space, he wanted economic resources and a place to grow. And then we wake up with Vladimir Putin, we find out that he wants satellite peoples, security, and a place to grow. And he was even, I even saw his speech where he talked about he wanted to make Russia great again. Well, this is the spirit, isn't it? Because the Chinese want to make China great again, and Donald Trump hasn't stopped beating the drum since 2016 about making America great again. So, North Korea was number 1 on the list, Russia was number 2. The American military-industrial complex, God bless them, they're not a sinister bunch of people, but they liked the idea that Russia was high on the list of potential threats because that justified America's renewal of its nuclear program and rearmament for the post-Cold War period. So that was very good news to them, and of course the second piece of good news was that the Chinese were on the make. There is a 78-year-old man at Harvard who reinvented himself the last couple of years. This is Graham Ellison in his famous concept of the Thucydides trap. Graham is always trying to get politicians and security people to understand history. I mean, history is important, and while it never repeats itself, it does, as Mark Twain says, rhyme a lot. It rhymes an awful lot. And Graham Ellison said that based on Thucydides' observation that Sparta went to war with Athens because Athens was a rising power and Sparta was a ruling power. Based on that, in the last 500 years, he saw 16 case studies of rising and ruling powers, and in only 4 case studies was war averted. And so he has produced an article, a book, seminar, and now he's got a whole group of people working at Harvard talking about the coming war with China and how to avert it. He is convinced that the Chinese are going to have to accommodate the Americans, and the Americans are going to have to understand what's going. And the thing is if you keep thinking about going to war with somebody, even as a social construct, the idea is that you probably will go to war with somebody. Last spring, American spring, I was in a seminar with Admiral Harry Harris, the head of the Pacific Fleet, at a seminar in Brisbane, and he told 20 of us that he saw 3 problems in the world today, in the Pacific anyway. Number 1 was the North Koreans, and he thought he could wrap them up in about a week. He didn't think they had any depth in the order of battle. He was sure they could take them out, and he had every nuclear weapon at his fingertips, and he made it very clear that Chairman Kim is one of these guys that went to bed every night not knowing whether he was going to wake up or not. He had as much pressure coming from his own generals as he did from the Americans. And it's hard to get sympathy for this kind of guy, but he wanted us to know there were 2 kinds of pressure on him. The second problem he saw was the rise of China, that is the Chinese position in the South China Sea. Long story short, the Chinese want 339 square million kilometers or something like that of untold natural gas, oil, and the fisheries. And to do so, they're going to pick a fight with at least 6 nations there, 3 of whom have formal and informal relations with the United States. Now, we have no bone to pick, but Admiral Harris makes it very clear that the Chinese will understand that Americans will fight for freedom of the seas. And he wants them to understand that if they fight for freedom of the seas, they'll be much better off down the road. Now, the Chinese he regarded as the #1 threat in the world today. Number 3 was the continued rise of terrorism. Last year, there were 121 terrorist organizations in the world who killed 84,000 people. Those are just the people we count. We don't know people we can't count. They killed 84,000 people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Nigeria, and places like that. So global terrorism is very much on the rise. Russian ambitions are very much on the rise. Chinese ambitions are much on the rise. And once Donald Trump's bromance with Chairman Kim dims, I'm sure we're going to have another crisis in that neck of the woods, because the Americans will not tolerate ICBMs pointed at Hawaii or its allies. And China's up all night trying to figure out how to make this happen, because what the Chinese fear the most are the Japanese and the South Koreans and others developing their own nuclear weapons. Now, I'm one of these old-fashioned guys who, well, I grew up with Bert the Turtle. You know, you duck under your seat when the thermonuclear attack comes and you're supposed to survive. I grew up with propaganda in the 1950s. Well, I know none of us are going to survive these kinds of things. But I discovered an interesting thing in my 40 books over the last 44 years, is that sometimes the spread of nuclear weapons makes the world a little safer, not more dangerous. Because as soon as you have a nuclear weapon, you discover right away that it's completely useless. You can't use it. You can threaten people. You can develop your coercive diplomacy or compelling diplomacy, but you can't use them because you know that you will be dead in the morning or about 15 minutes after you launch. Nuclear weapons are completely useless. And I'm not the first guy to say so. General Gawa, who was de Gaulle's #1 intellectual thinker, said the same thing in the 60s. A number of guys at MIT and Harvard say the same things, that maybe the spread of nuclear weapons is not so bad. And so when Donald Trump met Chairman Kim for about 1 hour and 50 minutes alone. And I know what Donald Trump was thinking. I come from the Midwest. I know those 63 million people who voted for Donald Trump. And you know, and you do a very bad day's homework thinking that this man has got a problem. Donald Trump is supported by Americans who don't have a lot of education, who don't read the New York Times, who don't subscribe to cable network news, but they are not unintelligent. These are the people who built America. These are the people who work the farms and the factories. And they don't like to be pushed around. And so Donald Trump was their wrecking post. Donald Trump didn't find them, they found him. He beat 16 guys by insulting everybody, and they didn't know what to say. You know, so, well, Trump has a number of personal problems. He has a very strong support base, and they're not unintelligent. They will support him right up until the end. And so Trump told Chairman Kim privately, from what I can figure out from the people I know, he said to him, "You can keep your damn weapons, but just don't point them at me." And that's exactly what has happened from that conference right up till today. People can't figure out why Chairman Kim hasn't denuclearized, because he ain't going to denuclearize. He isn't going to give up anything. Because Trump said to him, "You can have your toys, but just don't point those damn things at me." And that's the understanding that we have. And you know what? For all the people who don't like Donald Trump, he's the only president in my lifetime, and I've lived through 13 of them, who had every nuclear weapons leader, every nuclear weapons state on speed dial on his phone. He can call the leader of any country that possesses nuclear weapons and have that conversation before a launch. No, Barack Obama couldn't do it, Bush couldn't do it, his father couldn't do it, but he's on a name basis, first name basis with all these people, and they know it's coming. Now, I want to say something that will probably shock some people, and that is, I do not think America is in decline. I think it's in the middle of its unipolar expansion. I think we are in for a golden age of prosperity in the next 10 or 15 years. I don't think we're going to have war with China, though a lot of American military would like to have a war with China. And there are a lot of Chinese who would like to have a war with America. I read the Chinese defense papers a couple of years ago, and it's quite clear that the PLA has turned over most of its money to the PLA Navy to take on the American Navy. And the Chinese Navy thinks that it can take on the American Navy one day, maybe by developing doctrines that can sink American aircraft carriers, and Americans will abandon their allies by making the cost very heavy. Now, I had a PhD student who went to Kyoto for 10 years to research a book on Admiral Nomura, who discovered, and we discovered, that in the 1930s, the Japanese Navy was given all the money by the parliament there to take on the American Navy at the expense of the land forces, to take on the American Navy. And while most of the Japanese Navy leaders knew they could never win a war against America, they didn't know how to turn the money back. They took it out of pride, and they knew they were going to get their asses whipped. And that's exactly what happened. They knew exactly what was coming. Because once you kill Americans on American soil or on American islands, Americans don't go away. You know, we're like dogs to a bone. You can insult us all day, but as soon as you kill somebody, that's it. They're in the fight, right to the end. And so the Chinese Navy is making the same mistake as the Imperial Navy made, is they think they can take on the Americans. And they can't, because in the modern era, Americans will resort to small nuclear-tipped tactical nuclear weapons, which have never been counted, by the way. We count strategic nuclear weapons. During the Cold War, we created 128,000 strategic nuclear weapons, 98,000 by the Soviets and the Americans alone. Today, the Americans and the Soviets have about 7,000 of these weapons. Most of the weapons today that are going to kill you are tactical nuclear weapons, which can be mounted on planes and trains and boats and any other way you can deliver it. And America will use tactical nuclear weapons as the great equalizer, as indeed it did during the Cold War. We never were going to match the Soviets tank for tank, but we let the Soviets know that we would shoot first. And there's no doubt in my mind who's going to use a nuclear weapon first. We were the first to use it, and we'd be the first to use it again. There'd be no apologies. And so we've got this threat. Now, I think the Chinese will back off. And I think that Donald Trump will give them pretty much what they want in the South China Sea as long as they behave. Now, we got a lot of friends in the South China Sea, particularly the Vietnamese with whom we've cozied up to the last couple years, who are very unhappy with America's inability to push back the Chinese on the South China Sea. But we need the Chinese in North Korea, or we think we do anyway. So I asked my Vietnamese friends, who would you go to if you can't trust the Americans? And they think they'll be sold out by the Americans if push comes to shove. So they said they're renewing their contacts with the Russians because the Russians have proved incredibly reliable in the past. So what's Putin up to? Well, is he trying to recreate the Soviet Union? No, he's not. Not with his budget. He doesn't have that kind of thing. But he does have enormous capacity to cause mischief in different places. Particularly, I'm just looking at his war games in the East with Chinese and Mongolian troops. And people say to me, what are the Russians doing with Mongolian troops? Well, those are the Mongolian troops who liberated Vienna in Central Europe in 1945. They sent in their hard-nosed people who'd never seen an indoor toilet. And they sent in the warrior crowd when they came in. So I know why they're using them. They're shock forces. Anyway, Putin means business. I'm coming back to Central Europe. I'm coming to Vienna in October 12th to give a paper on early Cold War nuclear weapons, and then I'm going to Lithuania in January to the SNOW meeting, a security conference. I've done a model on how the Soviets or how the Russians can take over Lithuania in 72 hours. If anyone wants to email me, I'll be happy to send you my model. And so Lithuanians are terribly interested in this, but do they want to? Might there be an incident or an accident? So I think we're on this kind of possibility. Now, I gotta say something about where the Czechs are. The Czechs have the same ability to influence events that Australians have. Australians always, as they say, fight above their weight. Australians are in command posts in different places. They're seconded to the American military and the American Navy. In fact, you may not know this, but most of the Australian armed forces are interoperable with the American forces. So if there is a conflict and Australians worry about China, they're not worried about China exactly. They're worried about the American alliance that will drag them into a war with China. 78% of Australians think that the ANZUS treaty will drag them in. In your case, NATO would drag you into a conflict. So how do you hit above your weight? Well, you be good citizens or partners in NATO, because NATO is a major player. There are 5 major units in the world today. There's America, Russia, China, Europe, and the rest of free Asia. And as the great Otto von Bismarck once said, if you want to save yourself, you must think à trois. You got to be on the side that has 3 when you have 5. And Czechoslovakia is clearly ensconced in Europe, playing a leading role if it wants to, and it's ensconced in one of the 5. So your future is pretty bright. As I say, I think we're into the next golden age. As someone says to me, how do you know that? Because during the height of the Cold War, the international community ignored the tension between Washington and Moscow and continued to build and invest in skyscrapers all over the world. The world had this enormous capability, this enormous outgrowth of social and human capital during the Cold War, despite the worst moments of the Cold War. And I think we're in for the second round this time, despite the so-called trade war, which isn't really a trade war. It's just about how they're going to match their quotas at the end of the day and the rest of it. But I think we can avoid these conflicts. I like to say that the world is not really a mess, it's just messy. And it's our job to understand the peculiarities and the particularities of how to get around it. That's what the diplomatic corps does. That's what scholars do. That's what the media is supposed to do, explain the world to the world. And that's what I've been doing for the last 44 years. Hopefully, I get to see how the end of the game goes. But it's a great privilege to be back here with people who actually think about these kinds of things for a living. Australia has its think tanks and its universities, but they don't worry so much about Europe. I belong to the European Union Center at RMIT, the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in Melbourne, and we get to meet all your ambassadors, plus the EU ambassadors, so I've been dealing with these people for a number of years, and it's been a great pleasure. And when this young lady called me up last week, and I had about 5 days to get here, she said, can you come at the last minute? I said, of course I can, because for an opportunity to come back to Central Europe is a great thrill for me. Not to mention, I'm crazy about your sausages, too. Thank you very much. We'll have some questions now.
Thank you, Professor Siracusa. Would you like to sit down?
No, I'll stand. I've been sitting on that plane so long that standing is a pleasure.
Does anybody have any questions for Joseph Siracusa?
Oh, they'll think of something in a minute.
I think we need a bit warm up because it's still early morning. I guess one of my questions, topics that we have not touched, and you could maybe comment on our other, we have interesting panels such as space or energy. Do you have any thoughts where this specific, any of them fields will go in the future, what we should pay attention to in those spheres?
Well, space is very important. We had a number of strategic treaties to try to control what goes on in outer space, but we seem to have a number of countries today that aren't really interested in the treaties. They're kind of making up their own rules. We have sort of a disdain for not the liberal order, but for any order when it comes to these kinds of things. That's what I meant when I said the world is a little messy. And the energy thing is important because one of the 3 great problems in the world today is global poverty, and that cannot be solved without controlling the energy, either for our own country or others. And you don't have to be a genius to see that energy is going to play the important role, a vital role in our lives in the years ahead, particularly as global climate change impacts. I don't know if European parliamentarians think much about global climate change. you're so far inland, it's not much of a problem. But in Australia and New York, we worry about these kinds of things because we're going to have new capitals and new places. We're going to be on hills in the future. And it's quite clear to me that the energy policies that we pursue are crucial, particularly if they are weaponized. My Vietnamese friends tell me that the Chinese upstream are depriving them of water in the Mekong, and that they have farms that are dying. They have a man-induced famine and a crisis going on, or drought, and they don't quite know what to do about it yet. I mean, they're very worried about their farming in that neck of the woods, including their aqua farming. So energy is very, very important. Australia, of course, is sitting on a mountain of energy, so we don't much worry about that, but we do worry about everything else.
One of the topics that will take place after the coffee break is actually about the future of Europe or the European Union. So do you have any thoughts, because we deal with Brexit right now,
yes,
and that's going to change this environment and
yes,
interactions?
Look, through my work with the European Union centers in Australia, and we have 2 or 3 of them, we have a number of speakers on Brexit. And they're very slippery people when it comes to Brexit. They don't know what to say, and they don't know what the position is going to be tomorrow, or whether Theresa May is going to change her mind, and they're a little embarrassed about explaining it because they didn't think it should have happened. In fact, they thought it was a protest vote that went terribly wrong. Australian universities, and there are 43 of them, European history is not taught everywhere these days. So kids would rather study other things. They're interested in sociology and politics, but they're not real interested in European history. And that is because, do we have our Australians in the audience? This is going to get me in trouble. Because our left-wing friends, and I was on the left when I was growing up in America, but our really left-wing friends in Australian academic life regard European history as the worst example of colonialism in the world and don't want to teach European history because the Europeans did such a job killing people in Africa, Asia, and other places, and that there's this kind of hostility or antipathy towards European history, because when they look at European history, they don't see the great things that Europe has done. What they see is their colonial past. And as post-colonialists, they want to get away from it. And the best way to get away from it is to forget about it. So we have a lot of children in Australian universities who don't know much about European history. When I went to RMIT 12 years ago, the Vice Chancellor asked me to give them an historical context for the degrees in global studies. And our students have to take 6 months of internships to places like this. They have to do languages for 3 years, but they didn't know much history. So my job was to give them a couple courses on modern history. And for me, the modern period starts in the First World War. It's a very important story for the Australians to begin their story there, at least the modern period. In the First World War, Australia, with a population of less than 5 million, lost 59,000 men in the First World War. With a population of 180 million, America lost 58,000 during the Vietnam War, and we still haven't gotten over it. In the Second World War, which was to end the First War, which was supposed to, First World War was supposed to end the Second, was supposed to end war. Second World War produced 60 million people. So when I arrived in Australia, we had a lot of politicians and older people who'd seen a repeating of history. 20 million, 25 million, 60 million, and they'd seen the gulags, and they'd seen the barbed wire fences, and they'd seen the proxy battles of war, and at the, you know, who's going to defend anybody? And at the end of the day, it was the United States of America, because the United Nations, God bless it, doesn't work as well as it should work, because the original Security Council, they're the guys who still have the veto. So the United Nations, and we got many wonderful friends, and I have many of my students work for the UN, is just a kind of a snapshot of September 2nd, 1945. And that's the end of the story until we figure out how to secure the Security Council. I mean, you know, we go after the North Koreans because they violated the NPT, and the Security Council is supposed to dish out the punishment. But we don't go after Israel, India, or Pakistan. We never talk about what they do with their nuclear weapons because they never joined anything. So I like to tell my students, if you don't want to get divorced, don't get married. Just don't sign up. You can do what the hell you want to do. You can build up with as many weapons and scare as many people as you want. So, but Australians don't study European history as much as they want, and much as they should. So I make it a point to talk about the origins and the diplomatic origins of the First World War, the interwar period. We spent a lot of time on Munich. We spent a lot of time on the origins of the Second World War. We talk about Germany's attempt to take over the place twice in a lifetime. And then we talk about communism and the fall of communism and all the rest of it. And then we talk about the post-Cold War period. So I tried to give them a context about what kind of world we live in. And you know, and at the end of it, they're quite impressed. Now, most Australians come from Europe, but they know very little about Europe. And if I were to say that you should study Europe because you come from Europe, I'd be considered anathema to the post-colonial crowd who don't want to remind Australians that the post-colonial past were created by the Europeans. When I was a student at Colorado, we were told that the New World was an extension of European initiative, ideas, and money. Today, these are all considered sins of Europe, but I don't see it that way. I had 4 grandparents who had come from Sicily in the 1880s to America, and their people came from Illyria and Normandy in the 12th century, and so we have these great European roots. And I regard Europe as the sort of the fountain of the modern period. I mean, how can you know about the world or the legacy of the world without understanding European history and the great role that you have played and your ancestors have played? Or the roles they haven't played, which is also a lesson too, as a matter of fact. Next question.
We have a colleague from our institute, Jan Hornát.
Hi, my name is Jan Hornát. I'm from the Institute and from Charles University. Professor, your speech was fascinating. And one of the many things that caught my attention was what you said about Donald Trump and Kim and the Kim meeting. And I sort of, if this is true, I mean, so what are the implications, right? How can Donald Trump, let's say, justify this position towards his electorate, meaning that in the next 4 more years, there will be no denuclearization of North Korea? And how can he justify this, let's say, to allies like Japan and South Korea? Or did Donald Trump, let's say, even say that if you don't point it at us and Japan and South Korea? Yes, and can the North Korean regime survive without threatening these actors?
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, the Japanese are very nervous about Trump. Abe is nervous that he might have given away two-way. This is why Abe and the Chinese were the first to visit him in Washington, so he didn't give the game away. How do you explain this? Now, we know that there's a dissonance in the White House. The president thinks one thing and other people think other things, and God knows what John Bolton is thinking. I've never figured that out myself. But the only good news is he doesn't know what he's thinking either, so we're sort of safe there. The thing is that the president did something in Singapore which allowed each nation, each participant to carry away their own narrative. Isn't this wonderful? Everybody gets to tell their own story of Christmas and what happens. Kim gets to tell his people that he's kept the president at bay, and Trump is able to tell his people that this guy is under control. Now the military, you know, Mattis's people, they know that none of this is true, that he continues to have nuclear weapons. And you know, Trump knows they're not going to give up their nuclear weapons. Anybody with an IQ over 85 understands that North Korea is a nuclear weapon state and we got to live with it. And all this baloney and nonsense, this absolutism over the years that they must denuclearize. That word only is specific to the the Korean peninsula. We don't talk about that in arms control, nuclear arms control. This idea they have to get rid of all their weapons before they become good citizens. Well, it ain't gonna happen, not unless you want to start a war. And so we got several stories out there, and we know that Kim, you know, I don't really think Kim is completely in control. I think he has his military masters. He counts on those guys to keep him up in the night and protect him in the morning. And he owes his own people some prosperity. And so I think Kim played a nice role. You notice he likes the role. He likes appearing in public, and he likes press conferences and the like. He's starting to warm up to it, as a matter of fact. And so the president's got that story. Now, right up until the president met him, according to Johns Hopkins University, a special unit there, they reckon the chances of war over North Korea were 60 to 80%. 60 to 80% of an accidental conflict. After the president left Singapore, that went down to about 2%. So we're not talking about war. But it begs the question, the president probably brought this thing a little closer to war than he wanted to. But I think they had a chance to eye each other. Kim knows by looking at Trump that he will use nuclear weapons the way, you know, you go fishing. You know, you just put the worm on the hook and off you go, or whatever you do to go fishing. And he knows he's serious. And the thing is, the South Koreans are desperate that Trump is right. Right now, President Moon would conclude a peace treaty with a paper bag. He is so excited, or a ham sandwich. He's so excited that he's going to be able to make this legacy. Does this help anybody else in the region? My fear, and a Chinese fear, is that Japanese will acquire nuclear weapons, which they can have, what, by Monday morning. They can buy them off the shelf, or they can, it's not hard to find a nuclear weapon. There are lots of these things floating around. I do nuclear scenarios for different cities, and it's just, you know, it's easy to bring weapons in. You know, Australia's got 15 million containers that come into Melbourne, and only 2% of them are looked at. It's just dead easy how this is all going to happen. But anyway, so we got all these different narratives, and you know what? At the end of the day, the only person who's in charge is the President of the United States. You know, the military has a major role to play, and they say they will do this, this, and this. But if the President is convinced that North Koreans have settled down a little bit, and he said this morning, as you all saw on your television screens, you know, they dropped the nuclear weapons from their parade. And then you see the guys from the Rand Corporation, but they haven't gotten rid of any of their nuclear weapons. Well, who do you think you're talking to here? St. Peter? This guy's got the mentality of Adolf Hitler, for Christ's sake, you know? He's the master of doublespeak. If Kim says, I'm going to get rid of my nuclear weapons one day, it's like some dictator saying that one day we're going to have a workers' paradise. Well, a fat chance that's going to happen. It never happens. And so he's got his own story to tell. And Trump is able to persuade the Americans, and it kills the Democrats that Trump was able to cut a deal. You know, and Trump is prepared to sit down with the devil at any time. He's shameless about sitting down with anybody. In the past, we've said that to sit down with this man is to give him a legitimacy. Well, I say, if that's the price you have to pay to avert war on the Korean Peninsula, then give him an iota of, you know, legitimacy. That's all he wants. I don't care what he does with it. We can't make people do different things. So, but the president did a nice job by meeting him alone. That was very clever. Now, what he said to Putin alone. Now, there is no dirt file on President Trump. Putin doesn't have pictures of him doing anything. But we do know, in the president's early days, that he had a number of Russian business partners or secondary partners who were probably laundering Russian mob money all over the place. I'm sure that's true. And I'm sure the president could even probably survive that. But they don't have a dirt file on Trump. I mean, you've seen Trump's dirt file already with the various women who were coming forward writing books about him. And this morning on the CNN, Stormy Daniels said he's the worst lover she's ever had. Well, did you have to tell Ivana Trump that? I mean, it insults all the other women in his life, doesn't it?
I have to shift it back to the Czech foreign policy because we only have a few minutes left. Sorry. My question before we have our coffee break, and I'm going to make a little pitch here because you and I spoke about this book already. And that's a book that's on the table over there, The Czech Foreign Policy in 2017. And some of the authors are here at the symposium, so people will be able to hear their conclusions. But what is your take in terms of the interaction between these research institutes and ministries of foreign affairs and diplomats in terms of how much we can do to help with our advice? How much do you think it's taken on board? because you keep reminding us that Trump is the man in the room, and the advisors might not play such a big role.
Yes.
How much can we do, in some cases, as non-governmental institutions, in terms of foreign policy advice?
Well, when Woodrow Wilson went to Europe for the first time, the first president to visit Europe in office, to attend the meeting at Versailles, he brought with him a bunch of independent scholars, geographers, historians, whatever they were. They did all kinds of things, and they had all kinds of books. They were called the Inquiry. It was the first time that he actually invented a think tank to come along with him, and it caught on. And the think tanks in America, and I'm thinking of the Hudson Group in the 50s, the futurologists, they did very important work. And the Brookings does very important work. I am amused, though, that with Trump, this is the first time in my lifetime that Harvard and Brookings have nothing to do with the American government. He's completely shut them out. But he's brought in the Heritage Foundation and some other people who, you know, they don't mean badly, just most of the time they don't mean anything at all, actually. I don't know what they do exactly, but Harvard and Brookings has been left out. And these are very important organizations. Now, without these think tanks, without people who actually think for a living, you are the lifeblood of your foreign ministries. Unless the foreign ministries can count on its people to think about the world and the solutions to these world, then the foreign ministries don't have any ideas. And people who do not know how to move forward find out they can't move forward. And people who really can't think independently, one day don't even have to worry about their independence. You know, I always tell Australian audiences, up to you to solve the problems of the 21st century. It's up to the people who think for a living. And without your ideas and your brave ideas sometimes, foreign ministries would just fall over. I mean, what would they do? They just they get elected and they hire their friends. Well, that doesn't go very far. But you know, the think tanks play this very, very important role, particularly in the modern era where we live in a very complex place. And there's nothing brighter than a 35-year-old think tank intellectual on display. I mean, they're in full throttle. They don't know everything yet. They don't know that. When they get to be 70, they'll find out they didn't know everything. But their excitement and enthusiasm actually propels itself through the system. It's a force multiplier of ideas. And, you know, let me tell you, in a world without ideas, you know, as our great friend Socrates said, I don't want to be here. Thank you very much.